Okay, let's dive in. It's kind of surprising, isn't it, to think that Michel de Montaigne, this major 16th century thinker, described his own mind as galloping like a runaway horse, generating monsters and chimeras.
Mm-hmm.
It really shakes up that standard image,
Mm-hmm.
the calm intellectual. It points to something much more personal going on.
Absolutely. And what's so fascinating is that this inner turmoil wasn't something he hid. It was, in fact, the very engine for his work, for those incredible insights.
Exactly. And that's precisely what we're exploring today,
Yeah.
the essays of Michel de Montaigne. It feels particularly timely, too, because our expert guide here has actually written the foreword for a brand new translation.
That's right. It's by Frank de Graaf, coming out with Boom Publishers in June 2026.
A translation you're looking forward to, I gather.
Very much so. And
Mhm.
I hope our chat today gives you, our listeners, a real sense of why Montaigne still speaks to us so powerfully.
So our mission for you, the learner, is really to get beyond just knowing Montaigne as, the guy who invented the essay. We want to dig into the core insights he offers about life, about self-awareness, about navigating this, well, often confusing world. Think of this as a way to really grasp the enduring value of this complex, truly fascinating mind.
And if you think about our own lives today, Montaigne's whole project, this deep dive into understanding himself, making sense of things, it resonates so much with the challenges we all face, doesn't it?
It really does. So who was this person, Michel de Montaigne? Born in France, 1533. He had this unusual upbringing, learning Latin first.
Yes, his father had some very forward-thinking ideas about education, quite unique for the time.
Then he was a magistrate. Had that incredibly important friendship with Etienne de la Boétie.
A defining relationship for him, certainly.
And then, quite young, only 38, he just retires to write.
Mm-hmm.
And it's crucial to remember, like you said, these essays weren't just academic exercises. They came from a very, very personal place.
That period of retreat was absolutely key. It wasn't just about study, it was a direct response to profound personal loss. La Boétie's death hit him incredibly hard, and this deep need to get a handle on his own inner world.
Which leads us right into understanding Montaigne's character as it comes through in the writing. Now, we touched on this image problem, this serene aristocrat, but the reality, as you explore in your book, De Vrolijkheid Zoeken, it's much more complicated, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. That idea of effortless contemplation, forget it. Montaigne wrestled with significant anxiety, compulsions, a real undercurrent of melancholy.
Really?
Yes, and the essays became, in a way, a therapeutic tool. A method for him to confront those monsters and chimeras his mind was producing, especially after he stopped working and after La Boétie died. Writing was his way of observing these thoughts, trying to process the turmoil, that deep sadness.
That completely reframes how you approach those early essays. You mentioned his essay on idleness, that's chapter 8, book 1, as being really key to understanding why he started writing. Why is that one so revealing?
Well, what's fascinating there is how he initially saw idleness not as peaceful, but as something that actually stirred up his mind. He expected retirement to bring calm, but instead, his thoughts started racing, almost chaotically.
Uh-huh.
So writing became a way to sort of capture those thoughts, to pin them down, examine them, and ultimately try to regain some control over that internal chaos, that kind of melancholic state. So writing wasn't initially about grand philosophy, it was almost a personal necessity.
Right. So it wasn't about having all the answers, but about the process of managing his own mind, almost.
Yeah.
Now, he often described himself as pretty ordinary, didn't he? Even intellectually limited.
Mm.
Yet he poured himself into these essays and clearly wanted them read. How do those two things fit together?
It's a really interesting tension, isn't it? There's definitely a touch of, let's say, performative humility there. By calling them essays, just attempts, trials, he gave himself incredible freedom.
Right. No pressure.
Exactly. He could explore anything without needing definitive conclusions. But underneath that self-deprecation, there's clearly a desire for connection, for recognition, for his unique way of seeing things to resonate. It's complex, That human drive to understand oneself, but also to share that journey.
That makes perfect sense. By downplaying them, he actually liberates himself.
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about the essay form itself. You mentioned essay, the French word for test or attempt. How did Montaigne really live out that idea of testing?
Well, it's not just one thing, it's layered. There's the sense of weighing ideas, like testing gold for purity, essaying them.
Okay.
But it's also about constantly testing his own judgment, never just accepting his first thought. He brings in other authors, puts their ideas to the test against his own experience. And crucially, it highlights that an essay for him, is never finished. It's always open-ended, never the last word.
And this constant questioning, this testing, it's all wrapped up in his famous motto, que sais-je? What do I know? And you mentioned the Latin version too, pecho, I suspend judgment. How crucial are these for understanding him?
Oh, absolutely central.
Mhm.
Casesce and Impecho are the heart of his skepticism, his commitment to looking at things from all sides without always needing to land on a fixed conclusion.
Right.
It's about this profound awareness of how limited our understanding really is. Not nihilism, not saying we know nothing, but a kind of constant intellectual humility, acknowledging our perspectives are always partial.
So the real value isn't finding the answer, maybe, but the whole process of asking the question rigorously.
Precisely. But it's important not to mistake this for just random rambling. While he might not offer neat conclusions, if you read carefully, there's often a real structure, a clear path of inquiry.
Okay.
The act of thoroughly exploring a question, even without a final answer, has immense value for him and, I think, for us too.
This focus on the process, on practical exploration over abstract theory, that brings us nicely to his emphasis on praxis, on practical wisdom. You connect this to the Renaissance rediscovery of ancient philosophy. Can you unpack that a bit?
Yeah, it's fascinating. When Renaissance humanists looked back to antiquity, they weren't just interested in, complex logical systems for their own sake.
Right.
They were really drawn to how ancient thinkers tackled the big question: how do you live a good life? Philosophies like Stoicism, Epicureanism, skepticism, they were fundamentally practical.
Tools for living, almost.
Exactly. They offered frameworks, exercises, ways to orient yourself better in the world, to act more thoughtfully.
Yeah.
The complex ideas served that practical end. They weren't just intellectual games.
So philosophy wasn't just this abstract thing, but a guide for actually living. You mentioned Pierre Hadot's work here, too.
Yes, Hadot did brilliant work showing how ancient philosophy was often seen as a kind of spiritual exercise, a way to transform yourself, not just a set of doctrines to learn. Montaigne fits right into that tradition. He prioritizes lived wisdom, practical application over pure theory.
And this focus on his own life, his willingness to share thoughts that weren't always flattering or popular, that must have been pretty unusual for his time.
Oh, very much so. He presented himself with a remarkable honesty, warts and all. He wasn't really trying to please anyone or stick to conventions. That kind of frankness, while maybe more common now, was quite bold in the 16th century, especially for someone of his social standing.
And that directness didn't always go down well initially, did it? You mentioned some early criticisms.
No, it didn't. Initially, some people found him indecent, too personal, too revealing. Others thought the essays were just disorganized, rambling, lacking structure. They weren't used to such a subjective, exploratory style.
Yet, despite the critics and his own self-deprecation, you still feel that underlying desire for recognition, for the work to last. It's quite a paradox.
It really is. And his reputation in France, well, it's had its ups and downs over the centuries.
You trace that path in your book, Influential, then Overlooked, then Rediscovered.
Yeah.
Could you give us the quick version of that journey?
Sure. So in the 17th century, he was huge, big influence on Descartes, Pascal, the libertines. Even Voltaire acknowledged him, though he had criticisms too.
Okay.
Then the 19th century, things shift. The Catholic Church puts the essays on the index of forbidden books,
Wow.
which ironically kind of boosted his appeal to nonconformists like Flaubert and Nietzsche. They loved his independent spirit.
Right. The forbidden fruit effect.
Exactly. Then, much of the 20th century, academically in France, he was a bit neglected, didn't fit neatly into literature or philosophy. But since the 1980s or so, there's been this massive resurgence. He's now seen as a truly major figure, right up there with Molière or Racine in French intellectual history.
What a comeback.
Yeah.
Now, a really central theme you highlight is this idea of struggle in Montaigne. It wasn't just intellectual exploration. It was deeply personal grappling.
Absolutely fundamental. His turn to writing, as we said, came directly out of a period of intense inner turmoil, deep melancholy. He was dealing with huge personal losses and this profound unease about the world.
And his first port of call was Stoicism, right? Trying to manage those difficult emotions through reason. You mentioned Seneca, Epictetus, and the influence of Lipsius.
Yes, the Stoic idea of using reason to govern emotions, to build inner resilience against external blows, that really appealed to him initially. The goal was mental fortitude, mastering your feelings and beliefs through rational thought. That struggle for self-mastery was key to his early engagement with Stoicism.
Which, as you noted, seems a bit different from his later skepticism about pure reason. How did that view evolve?
Well, Montaigne was never static. He was always rethinking, questioning himself. He eventually found the limits of a purely Stoic approach, especially when facing something as raw as the fear of death. While Stoicism advocated rationally accepting mortality, Montaigne discovered that intellectual understanding didn't necessarily quiet the underlying fear.
And he had so much direct experience with death. His friend, his father, a child,
Yeah,
plus the wars of religion, the plague. It wasn't abstract for him.
not at all. It was intensely real. And he realized that just thinking about death wasn't enough. While Stoicism preached rational acceptance, Montaigne kind of shifted towards a different kind of acceptance, a hard-won indifference almost, achieved by fully engaging with life itself.
Which makes me think of that incredible quote. I want death to find me planting my cabbages, neither concerned about it nor, still less, about the garden that is unfinished.
Exactly, that's the spirit. It's about embracing the present, finding meaning in the doing, not being paralyzed by the end.
Yeah.
And interestingly, he didn't shy away from difficult related topics either. He explored suicide, looking at the customs on the island of Sia, examining different, sometimes paradoxical examples. It just shows his nuanced, non-dogmatic way of thinking. No easy answers, just exploration.
He really does turn over every stone. You also mentioned his thoughts on his own upbringing, how he felt his privileged start maybe didn't fully prepare him.
Yes, looking back, he felt his somewhat, perhaps overly gentle upbringing hadn't quite given him the toughness, the resilience needed for life's inevitable hardships.
Right.
He came to see the value in a sterner education, one focused on building character, virtue, courage, self-control, not just filling the head with knowledge, developing the whole person, really.
Makes sense. Okay, let's shift gears a bit to that really important essay, The Apology for Raymond Sebon.
hmm
What was the story behind that one, and how did it lead to his, well, revolutionary ideas about animals?
Okay, so the starting point was quite specific. His father asked him to translate this book, Sebon's Theologia Naturalis. It argued for God's existence using reason and nature.
Right.
But later, the book got into trouble, ended up on the church's index. Montaigne felt he had to defend it.
But the defense went way beyond Sebon, didn't it? It took this amazing turn.
It absolutely did. Instead of just propping up Sebon's arguments, Montaigne launched this incredibly broad, radical critique of human reason itself. He started questioning our assumed superiority over animals, seriously exploring their intelligence, their emotions.
Which was just miles ahead of his time, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Especially thinking about someone like Descartes later on.
Incredibly so. Long before Descartes dismissed animals as basically machines, Montaigne was looking closely at their capacity for thought, learning, adaptation, even feeling. It was a massive break from the standard human-centric view.
You mentioned some of his observations, like the dog at the crossroads. Can you share that one?
Oh, it's a brilliant example. He describes a dog tracking its master, coming to a fork in the road. It sniffs two paths, finds no scent.
Okay.
Then, without checking the third path, it immediately runs down it. Montaigne argues this shows deduction the dog reasons that since the master isn't on the first two, he must be on the third. He suggests this is a form of logic we usually reserve for humans. He also talks about bird nest building, suggesting it's more than just instinct. There's skill, learning, a kind of understanding involved. Honestly, I really urge listeners to read that essay. It's quite something.
It sounds incredible and still so relevant. Now, another huge relationship for Montaigne was his friendship with Etienne de la Boétie. You describe it as profoundly important.
Exceptionally so. Montaigne himself uses extraordinary language to describe it far beyond ordinary friendship. He saw it as this perfect meeting of minds and souls. It shaped him immensely, intellectually and emotionally.
And he writes so much, so movingly about La Boétie, but is relatively quiet about his wife and children. That's led to speculation, hasn't it, about whether there was maybe a romantic element there.
It's a question that naturally comes up for modern readers, yeah. Montaigne himself gives no explicit hint of anything romantic. His focus is all on the unique intensity of their connection, their intellectual bond. And you have to consider the context, 16th century France. Intense male friendships, often expressed in very passionate language, weren't unusual. So while the silence about his family is interesting, concluding it was romantic based just on speculative, Montaigne's own famous line about it, because it was he, because it was I, kind of captures that unique, almost inexplicable quality for him.
Yeah, that says so much, doesn't it, regardless of how we label it? Okay, so for someone new to Montaigne, facing this huge work, where should they start? Any advice?
Absolutely. First, don't feel you have to read it all or start at page 1 and go straight through.
Good to know.
I often suggest maybe starting with book 3, especially the final essay of Experience.
Yeah.
His later work often focuses more on practical wisdom, the lessons learned from life. It can feel more mature, maybe more immediately accessible.
Interesting. So jumping towards the end might be a good entry point.
For some readers, definitely, especially if you're looking for those personal reflections on living well. I might also suggest maybe skipping the very early essays in Book I at first. Some of those can be a bit more factual lists of things, less immediately engaging, perhaps.
Okay, good tip. You also recommended Of Cannibals, Book 1, Chapter 31. Why that one?
Of Cannibals is just brilliant. It really shows Montaigne's critical, comparative mind at work. He uses accounts of indigenous peoples from the Americas to question European customs and the whole idea of civilization versus barbarity.
Right. Challenging assumptions.
Exactly. And it has that amazing anecdote about the 3 Brazilian natives brought to Rouen.
Yes. What did they find so strange about France?
Well, they thought it was utterly bizarre that a child could be king, questioning hereditary power.
Makes sense.
And they were baffled by the sight of extreme poverty right next to obvious wealth. They couldn't understand why the poor didn't just, rise up and challenge it. Montaigne also says they made a third point about power dynamics, which he frustratingly forgot. It just brilliantly highlights the relativity of our own norms.
Such a powerful early piece of cultural relativism. And you connect this to later ideas like the noble savage in Rousseau and Voltaire.
Yes, his willingness to see value, even wisdom, in cultures so different from his own really paved the way for later critiques of European ethnocentrism. It sparked conversations about society and human nature that echoed for centuries.
It's clear Montaigne is hard to pin down, isn't he? You said it's tough to stick him in one philosophical box, yet so much of him feels strikingly modern. How do those two things coexist?
That's the magic of Montaigne, I think. He's absolutely a man of his time, 16th century French aristocracy, involved in its structures, but his thinking constantly breaks free. Stephen Tolman had that great idea that Montaigne represents an alternative path to modernity, one focused less on the pure abstract rationality we often associate with Descartes and the Enlightenment, and more on self-awareness, the richness of experience, intellectual humility.
A different kind of modernity. That's fascinating.
Yeah.
But there was a link to Descartes, right? Even if they went different ways.
Oh, definitely. Descartes read Montaigne closely, and Descartes' starting point, that radical skepticism, the questioning of everything, owes a huge debt to Montaigne's own deep skepticism.
Right. The I think, therefore I am comes after the doubt.
Exactly. That initial moment of doubt is very Montaignian. Even some of Descartes' comments about his own education echo Montaigne's reflections on the limits of book learning.
So, shared starting point, different destinations. Now, speaking of influences, you mentioned the inscriptions in his tower. Give us a snapshot of his early reading.
Yes, those 56 or so inscriptions he had painted on the beams when he retired around 1570 are like a window into his mind then. Lots of Stoicism. Epictetus features heavily. Clear Epicurean strains, too, often via Horace. And crucially, skeptical mottos right there on the main beams: apecho, skeptomai, examen, made noggin. Nothing truly exists. Plus some Old Testament passages, too. That blend of classical and biblical wisdom was typical for humanists.
Quite a mix. You said Stoicism was strong early on, but then Pyrrhonian skepticism became really important. How did that shift happen?
Discovering Latin translations of Sextus Empiricus, the key figure for Pyrrhonian skepticism, seems to have been a major turning point.
Oh.
This was a really radical skepticism, suspending judgment on almost everything because arguments on both sides often seem equally strong. It just resonated deeply with Montaigne's own questioning nature and his growing sense of uncertainty. It became a dominant thread in his later thinking.
And Pyrrhonism wasn't just about doubting, but aiming for.
Ataraxia, freedom from mental disturbance. The idea was that by suspending judgment, you could achieve a kind of inner peace.
Got it. And later still, he got really into Lucretius and the Rerum Natura.
Yes, he annotated his copy heavily. He was clearly fascinated by Lucretius's materialism, his atomic view of the universe, and especially by Lucretius's attempt to combat the fear of death by arguing it's just dissolution, nothing to fear.
Right, tackling that core anxiety again.
Exactly. Given Montaigne's own lifelong grappling with mortality, Lucretius offered a powerful, more scientific way to think about it, less reliant on metaphysics.
It really shows him in constant conversation with these thinkers, wrestling with their ideas against his own life. Okay, one last area, Montaigne and the Reformation. He lived right through those terrible French wars of religion. Where did he stand?
Yes, a hugely violent and divisive time. Montaigne himself was Catholic, but his consistent message in his life and writing was one of peace, moderation, and religious tolerance.
And his skepticism, his que sais-je, fed into that stance on religious conflict.
Absolutely. His basic doubt about human reason's ability to grasp ultimate theological truths made him deeply wary of the dogmatism fueling the violence. He'd point to complex doctrines like transubstantiation and basically say, how can we be so sure about these things that we're willing to kill each other over them? Our understanding is limited.
Right.
So that skepticism fostered a humility that underpinned his call for tolerance. He also strongly opposed the witch trials happening then, another sign of his humane, forward-looking views. As a humanist, he was definitely a key voice pushing for tolerance in France.
So, wrapping up our deep dive, Montaigne really emerges as this incredibly complex, self-aware figure. His essays give us these profound insights into ourselves, the world, the limits of what we know. And his own struggles really fueled this whole new way of writing that still resonates so much today.
Absolutely. And for you, the learner, I really hope you'll explore his essays yourself. Maybe start with the ones we suggested, or definitely look out for that new translation coming in 2026. His willingness to just sit with uncertainty, his emphasis on lived experience, they offer such valuable perspectives for our own, often confusing times.
And maybe a final thought for you to chew on. In a world that often demands quick answers and certainty, how does Montaigne's embrace of both skepticism and the richness of life challenge us? Could cultivating a bit more of that Montaignean curiosity, that acceptance of ambiguity, actually lead to a more fulfilling, maybe less stressful way of engaging with it all?
A great question to ponder. And as we mentioned, Frank de Graaf's new translation, With My Forward, will be out in June 2026, a fantastic resource if you want to delve deeper into Montaigne's world.